Hello, and welcome back to the Manage Engine Insights podcast. I'm John Donegan, an Enterprise Analyst at Manage Engine, and I'll be your host. Today, we're talking about social engineering and data privacy, and I'm pleased to be joined by Matt Polak. Matt is the founder and CEO of Picnic, a DC-based cybersecurity firm providing unprecedented enterprise-wide protection from social engineering. Matt is a subject matter expert in intelligence collection, having spent his career applying these skills to intractable growth and competitive strategy challenges for Fortune 500 customers. Matt's extensive experience and expertise in the field of human intelligence inspired Picnic's creation as a means to protect people from open source intelligence gathering by hackers. Prior to founding Picnic, Matt was the founding partner of Broad Branch Advisors, where he directly supported over $200 billion worth of successful M&A transactions in over a dozen industries ranging from cybersecurity to life sciences. Some of his early career roles included working in iBanking and as an intelligence analyst. Matt holds dual MBAs from UCLA's Anderson School of Management and in Chile, La Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. He received his BA in International Affairs from James Madison University, and he speaks with us from the Washington, D.C. area. Matt, thanks so much for coming on the Manage Engine Insights podcast. Picnic is a high-flying, well-funded startup that you are the CEO and founder of based out of DC, right?
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
And so what is the focus of Picnic? I guess just to back up a step, what even is social engineering for those who don't know, and why has it become such a huge problem?
Yeah, well, so, what I would maybe start out just by saying is that for those that maybe don't know the Picnic acronym, it's an old, the Picnic name, I guess I should say, it's an old IT security acronym that stands for the problem in the chair, not in the computer, right? So sort of a cheeky way of talking about, the challenges that humans have working with technology, right? And so we felt like that was a pretty good way to talk about all the problems of social engineering, which are just fundamentally human problems. So just a little bit of background on the name. I think our point of view about this problem is that if you look at the way the industry has developed over the last 20 odd years, what we've seen is just a lot of investment going into technical infrastructure, right? There's sort of layers and layers of defenses that have been built. And, that's great. Those have been largely successful. If you look at the volume of classic, infrastructure-based attacks, the volume of those that are successful today are pretty small, right? I think it's sort of less than 3%, depending on which statistic you believe. And, what's happened is that as a result of that hardening, what we've seen is a transition to attacking the human operating system is how people talk about it a lot, right? Or the human layer. And, that's really what social engineering is all about. But, just to unpack that a little bit more, I would say that it's not a really well understood thing, right? You talk to people about social engineering, and usually the reaction is, okay, well, this is about phishing, or maybe it's, hey, these annoying SMS messages that I get. But really at its core, what social engineering is all about is all about tricking people. And, that's sort of that art of trickery. And so we went super deep on this problem. And if you kind of unpack it and peel it back all the way, what you find out is that it's really a data problem. Because if I don't know anything about John, or I don't know anything about Matt, it's really hard to trick somebody. And so, so that's just sort of how we think about the problem. And I think, it's one of the most important things for folks to understand about this problem is that, it starts with research, right? It starts with reconnaissance, to use a security term, right? And that's really what this is all about.
Right. So how are these social engineering attacks crafted? Like, how does an attacker come up with a scam or choose a target, or what are kind of the most common types of attacks? Phishing, business email compromise, or
sure? Yeah. I mean, I think those are really common ones for sure. There's the FBI tracks lots of stats about this as far as what's reported. Identity theft is an example that's on the consumer side that's very common, and there's lots of that's going on. Obviously, business email compromise, spear phishing, SMS phishing, all these kinds of things are, different types of attacks. And, I think maybe just to talk about a recent example, just to give it some flavor, there's been a lot of press about, for example, the Okta breach, or what was the one the other day? Oh, there's so many of them. So it's hard to keep track.
There was a
Twilio. So Twilio was a big one, and Cloudflare was caught up in the same one. Slightly different outcomes for those organizations, so they have different security practices. But what really happened there, which I think is akin to what happens in most of these sophisticated attacks, is that essentially the attackers, in this case, they believe it was Octopus, went and researched the organization. They researched the people in the organization. They, and I'll talk maybe a little bit more about what that really means, but they went in, they understood who in the organization could be targeted. They spun up some domains that were similar to known domains that the target companies had, so they could impersonate them effectively. And then they started attacking the individuals in the organization, in this case, mainly by text message, trying to basically trick them to log into a website that was more or less like a watering hole site, something that looked a lot like the site where you would go log into your VPN or your single sign-on.
Right.
Federated page. And that's sort of how these things come together typically. And so I think what's really interesting to me, at least, is that if you look at the cases of Twilio and Cloudflare and some of the organizations that were caught up in this recent attacks, right, what really happened is that there was a lot of reconnaissance that was done at scale. And so what that means is that we believe that they started with LinkedIn.
Okay.
And so they looked at Twilio and they looked at Cloudflare and they looked at these other organizations on LinkedIn to identify who are the people that are most likely, would be the best targets, essentially. Who are the folks that look like they might have privileged access, for example, or they might have access to these systems. Imagine step one is, let's do that, right? Let's go look at LinkedIn. Let's look at Twilio. Let's look at Zoho. Let's look at whoever, and let's make a list of people that we think would be the best to target, right? So that's step one. You can get a lot of information from LinkedIn, right? So that's a fairly juicy place to start.
Right. And you're mostly looking for who conceivably has privileged access to the network, not necessarily who's like the most gullible person.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think these attackers are looking for that. They're looking for some evidence of privileged access, right? It could be network. It could be some other sort of system that might be useful. It could be someone too, oftentimes, that's more of a mid-level employee who's perhaps working in the group that is in charge of a certain function, right? And so they're trying to trick Matt or John in an effort to get access to our identity so that they can use that identity to, either attack someone else or to move laterally in the organization. So, that's sort of a typical kind of an approach. But so in the case of what happened with this particular set of attacks, right, they essentially developed a target list, right? Is a good way to think about it. They then looked inside of other data sets, so specifically looking inside of data broker data. Okay. And we talk a little bit about what that is, if that's useful. And also inside of breach data. And then they essentially stitch these things together to come up with kind of a complete profile of a human that they wanted to go after.
Okay. And so I know you guys kind of scour the whole attack surface, looking at, social media, data brokers, as you said, breach repositories, and like the deep and dark web, probably to a lesser extent, or I don't know. How can companies, I guess, just in general, get a handle on, how secure their attack surface is, and like individual employees? Is there like tips that the IT or the CISO can be like, you guys should all be doing this? I don't know. Is it contacting data brokers saying, take this down? Is not posting stuff on media or something else entirely?
It's a tricky space to deal with in a one-off way, is what I would say, right? So there's a lot of good technologies that have been developed over the last, 5 or so years that focus on what I would describe as, more classically defined attack surface. So think about technical attack surface infrastructure, right? Exposed services and so on. And so there's a lot of companies that are working on that problem. And I think that's really great. And that's a little bit of the story that we talked about at the beginning around hardening that infrastructure, right? And so I think when you start to think about, okay, well, how do I begin to think about hardening the human layer, the human OS, all the employees and the contractors that I have that are working inside my company? I think you're right that an effort to try to clean up data brokers is important. I think an effort to try to reduce the sort of the attractiveness, let's say, of people's profiles on social media, in particular on LinkedIn, is really important. And, making sure, I think the third category would be breach data. There's some other data out there that'd be relevant to talk about too. But so those would be the 3 different categories that I would encourage people to think about when it comes to just, if everyday advice, right? I would say some good best practices for folks when it comes to LinkedIn. Let maybe talk about that one in particular.
Sure.
Hey, don't, and this may sound obvious when I say it, but it's something that folks often just do because it's easy. Don't reuse the same picture between your different
Ah,
social media accounts, right?
I'm guilty of this. I'll be
Yeah,
guilty of all of these things, I bet.
very common, right? It's because it's easy, right? You find a
Yeah,
picture you like, and
for
it's,
sure.
hey, I'm just going to use this across my accounts, and
Yep.
but that's a way that it makes it easier to research you between LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you might
True.
have social accounts. So that's something that's relatively easy to know about yourself, and relatively easy to change. I'd say another
Yeah.
thing that's kind of maybe sounds obvious when you say it, but it's not obvious, until you really think about it, is actually geographic information, right? So
Hmm.
one of the key ways that I can figure out, which John Donegan you are, which Matt Polak you are, which Jane Smith, which Joe Smith, is by you telling me where you live, or where you have lived in the past.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that removing that geographic information from LinkedIn is actually a really important thing to do if you want to try to make yourself harder to research
Mm-hmm.
in other data sources. And I think this is a I don't know, there's my personal opinion about this, is that this is a place where the social media companies have done a really good job of making you the product, right? So if you
Of
think
course.
about
Yeah. Yep.
the experience that you have on LinkedIn, just to pick that one,
Mm-hmm.
if you go, and when you go, I shouldn't say if, because I know you're going to go do this, right? But when you
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
and remove your geographic information, it's going to say to you, oh, John, if you give us your zip code, you'll have a premium profile. You'll be a professional user.
Right.
You'll be able to be found by more people and all this kinds of stuff. And that might be true, but it's also not good to have that be possible in all cases, right? So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so I think that's a good one for folks to be aware of. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
don't know. How feasible do you think that would be for you as an individual? If I came to you and I said, John, let's fix your pictures, let's change your addresses, do you think you'd do it?
Yeah, I probably would drag my feet a little bit just because our company, we have 10,000 people, right? And
Yeah.
maybe I'll do it, but I kind of doubt everyone will do that for various reasons. But yeah, I mean, I think theoretically that sounds like a simple ask, I guess. Yeah. We just did a survey, and what we learned in part was that the onus at the C level, they seem to think that it's the CISO's responsibility to protect the security of the company, and not really like all the little guys in the company. But really, we try to argue that like everyone shares that responsibility to an extent, and so this would
Yeah.
fall under that umbrella, obviously. I'm wondering, just aside from social media, or like asking data brokers to take down publicly facing data, like how since COVID, or just even in the past couple of years or whatever, how much has the attack surface expanded? Are we seeing new threat vectors, like whether it's, phishing attacks, like voice phishing, or my sister fell. I have 4 little sisters. The youngest one fell for something. She's like in a feud with Bank of America right now, trying to get the money back. It was like one of her first jobs out of college, and she thought it was like a request from her supervisor, but really it was coming. I mean, it involved a gift card. Like in hindsight, she feels really,
Oh yeah.
she feels embarrassed by it. But yeah, I mean, it's a real thing, and it
Can happen to anybody, right? There's no.
anybody. Yeah, yeah. I guess the question there, if there was one in there, was, is the attack surface expanding? And what do you think about these new threats, whether it's within like the Web3 ecosystem, or the metaverse, or deep fake audio, or what have you?
Yeah. Well, I think it is. I think it is expanding. I think I think it is. It's getting more complicated for security teams. You mentioned this idea that the CISO, or the security organization, is kind of charged with protecting the company, and I think it's a new challenge, right? Because the pre-COVID, most of the people were, kind of wrapped in layers of security inside your systems in a way, right? And
Yeah.
how, I mean, I'm sitting at home today. You're sitting at home today, right? It's this sort of distribution of humans has happened at a much more rapid pace than never mind security, that anybody was ready for, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is a real problem. And, I think that the role that, for example, you mentioned data brokers, the role that data brokers play in this is real, right? Because now, hey, you're not at the office, right? How am I going to find you? How am I going to get in touch with you? And now I've got your home address. I've got your cell phone number. I've got your home email. I know who your neighbors are, right? There's a lot of things I can know about you from this broker information that makes it easier if I wanted to try to vish you, do a voice-based phishing attack.
Yeah.
Could impersonate one of those people, right? I could impersonate a neighbor. I could impersonate, the local tax collector, whatever, right? And
Yeah.
it's really that knowledge about your personal attack surface, much more than your business attack surface, right?
Hmm.
People are kind of trained, hey, at work, I'm at work, should keep my guard up, got to be careful. And now you're at home, right? And it's like, it's hard to remember, should I be defensive? Should I not be defensive? And so it's
Yeah. 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 Just to talk about the data brokerage industry for a second, I've read different think tanks, right-leaning think tanks and left-leaning folks on the Hill. And just to play devil's advocate, the right-leaning folks are saying, as shadowy as this industry supposedly is, the credit agencies, like in the 90s were considered in the same fashion. But today we take it for granted that they provide a service as far as assessing whether someone is, a candidate for a loan or what have you. So I think it might gain some respectability down the road, but right now they're kind of operating with impunity and can kind of buy or sell adults' data for the most part. Tech companies and these data brokers and the government and law enforcement can basically purchase any of our data, as far as I understand it, without any repercussions whatsoever. So that seems like something from a legislative standpoint that probably should be addressed. Yeah, I mean, you
I
being
agree.
in the DC area, I can edit all this out too, as far as sorry,
Don't tell me where I live, man.
I just outed your exact location. I've learned a lot on this call, you can tell. I guess the question is, do you see this industry getting reined in at any point, or
Yeah. So there's some legislation moving through, the House and the Senate right now that's focused on privacy. It's I forget the acronym, but it's sort of like the American Privacy Act or something along those lines.
yeah, the American Data Privacy and Protection
Yeah,
Act, I think.
exactly. That's the one. Yep. And, I think that's a good step. I do think that if you go in and read the specifics of what they're proposing, I think you're right that it doesn't really even properly address the data broker problem. It starts to maybe edge toward a framework that could be useful at some point, right? But it's not,
Yeah.
there's no teeth to it, right?
Yeah, no, I think the only thing that proposed bill, which is having trouble getting past Pelosi even, but as I understand it, I think they want to have a public registry where you can actually see, oh, okay, this is a data broker. Because right now, yeah, we know the big players in the space, but we don't really know, there's like tons and tons of people. So just having that registry would be cool. But at the same time, people need to sign off on providing their data. It can't just be out there for the taking. So
totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. And, I forget where I read the stat, but I believe it was in 2020 that the data brokers spent more money on lobbying Congress as a combined entity than Facebook and Google.
Yeah, I believe it.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's a pretty shocking, statistic right there, so.
No, it is. But I'm not surprised by that, considering how little we've seen in the way of bills even getting proposed. As far as
there's kind of the backstory on where the data broker data comes from.
No, I mean, is it OSINT stuff or?
Well, so it's a mix, right? But there's you mentioned credit bureaus. So one of the key ways that data brokers get data, this is really horrible, but true. One of the key ways that they get their data is actually that the credit bureau sells something called a credit header file to organizations like LexisNexis that mixes that data with other data such as DMV records and housing data and so on. And then they create something called a teaser file that they sell out to these different data brokers. And so, it's one of the most troubling things about this problem is that it's kind of a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it actually starts with the credit bureaus,
right?
Kind of abusing their rights and privileges that they have been granted by Congress. It's not okay, right? And it's sort of wrapped in this. Well, we have to be able to do this so that we can provide law enforcement with data, or we have to be able to do this to be able to provide credit, credit underwriting to banks and so on.
Right.
I think it's challenging to pull apart the good from the bad, right? When it gets all muddled together. So yeah, I'll be very interested to see how this plays out.
Yeah. Well, the landscape does seem to be shifting a little bit. Just the fact that we're even having this conversation and bills are even being drafted and the lobbyists are having to shell out the money and the public's becoming more aware. Do you accept these cookies and we don't read anything? We just hit yes the whole time. But yeah, let's see what else we got. Oh, so these states, I think 3 of them, North Carolina was the first state, and then I believe Pennsylvania followed. A bunch of these state legislatures are thinking about banning ransomware payments. It's a very contentious issue, experts on both sides, and it's very complicated from a policy standpoint. What do you think about these proposed bills that certain states, North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania, I think 3 have already passed them, and then Texas is in the mix. There's a half dozen others who are exploring this notion that, hey, we won't be targets if we make it illegal to outright pay the ransomware payment. And then there's like a safe harbor provision where, because they want people to report the incident so we can all gather information, and obviously nation states are involved, so it can become like a national security issue, even though it's a profit motive more than they're not trying to wreak havoc most of the time. They're just trying to extort people out of money. So these criminals, do you think this is a good thing that the states are trying to ban the payments, or do you think maybe this creates more problems down the road? And again, just to clarify, it's local and state government entities.
Yeah. I mean, so I think maybe it's useful to just think about this from an economic point of view, and just supply and demand, right? So never mind whether or not it might actually work, which is a totally different question.
Sure.
Imagine a world where they successfully outlawed the payment of ransomware, and all the banks and the hospitals that might need to have their data back and, as fast as possible to save people's lives sort of agreed, okay, fine, we're not going to pay the ransom. Okay, let's just accept that, right? So there's no supply of cash, you can think about a supply of cash or demand for payment or whatever, right? But that the supply and demand imbalance goes out of whack in these states. So maybe it flows into the other states, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about whether or not this would be successful broadly. I don't think that at a state or local level that they're going to actually be able to make any impact on this problem for themselves. And at best, they moderately improve their situation, but at the same time, make everyone else's situation worse. To me, it doesn't seem like it's the kind of thing that's ripe for success here.
Yeah. I personally think like a better way to attack that, or a different angle to look at, would be attack the method of payment, right? Cryptocurrency. Like Monero is the one that's like untraceable altogether. I think if you put more laws around that, but I guess that goes against the whole ethos of crypto. But I think that's kind of a different angle that one could look at as far as, trying to crack down on the industry as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of the things that we're working on too can actually directly help address this risk of ransomware as well, right? So, if you think about the fact that nearly every successful attack starts with social engineering in some form or another, that, by the way, that includes ransomware. If you can effectively limit the attack surface of the humans that are the pathway to the systems that can be effectively ransomed, so think if you've got exchange servers or, things that are typically classically ransomed, on-premise data, on-premise infrastructure, right? You can know who is connected to those systems. You can begin to think differently about how to limit the accessibility of them from the outside, through the humans who would be the pathway. So I think, there's a lot of exciting stuff that we're doing around this problem that could actually help people address the problem before it becomes a problem, which is a big part of how we think about trying to, generally speaking, how we try to think about solving this.
Right. Yeah, no, that all makes sense. I was listening to someone the other day, or I was reading an article, I think, and I was very surprised. Maybe I'm naive, but these like ransomware as a service, like organizations, they have payrolls. People get paid on like 1st and 15th. There's like hundreds of people globally working for them, and they're all, I'm sure they get paid by crypto, but it almost doesn't even matter, right? I mean, these folks probably have 401ks, right? And they're
it's organized crime, right?
No, it's crazy. Yeah. No, it's wild. And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. No, it's kind of a scary situation.
Yeah. And I think, when I think about where this problem of social engineering is heading in the future, we talked earlier a little bit about this idea that in the case of Octopus, right, how they at scale research people on LinkedIn, at scale found personal data on data brokers, at scale mixed that data with breach data to create a complete profile of a human. That kind of thinking, we're going to see social engineering as a service develop here, if it's not already something that's formalized. So, and so that to me is one of the likely near-term happenings that we'll see emerge as a service that you can buy. You can buy pieces of it today,
right?
From different organizations. And sometimes it's kind of couched in this idea of an initial access broker, an IAB.
Okay.
But a lot of that is, relies on being excellent at social engineering. So.
Right, right. And so it seems like a lot of what you guys do is you assess the attack surface and the open source intelligence, and you use that to protect against social engineering attacks, almost like a blue team, I guess, or like a purple team.
Yeah. So, typically you've got in the organization, you've got red team that's on the outside trying to break in, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got blue team that's playing defense, on the other side. And
Yep.
then purple team is usually a collaboration between those organizations in some way. Every company does it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
What's interesting, if just in that construct, we have built essentially offensive capabilities that you would see inside of, frankly, a government organization, or inside of a very sophisticated red team. Mm-hmm. We've built that at scale, but we've made it into a defensive tool rather than an offensive tool. So we've taken, so just turn it around, right? So it's, hey, John is a major target. We would want to attack John for these reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
John is at risk of attack. Let's make sure that we help the organization understand how to protect itself from attack through John, and also to protect John as an individual.
Right.
Because I think that's a really interesting element of this problem, is that as an employee, right, your attack surface, which is both work and personal, it's your attack surface, right? And that, that essentially is the pathway into the organization, and to get you to make changes to some of that, which you control, the company doesn't control.
Right.
You've got to be bought in, right? It's got to be good for you too.
Right.
Got to help you as well. And so I think that idea of helping, as part of what we're trying to do, is help make people safer at home and at work,
right,
through the activities that we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, especially with COVID and so many people working remotely and using their own, maybe not corporate sanctioned devices, BYOD devices. There's a lot of talk or questions around malicious insiders, but usually it seems to me, at least, that 999 times out of 1,000, it's not a malicious insider per se. It was, it was an innocuous thing, and someone just didn't handle themselves well or whatever.
Yeah.
There was no malicious intent to kind of take down the company from inside. But obviously there is that 1 in 1,000, right? And I'm making up that number. But do you guys have a way to kind of ascertain whether someone is like a malicious insider? Because they do exist, I guess.
Yeah. I think that everyone's always, and I think especially senior executives, their mind often goes to, well, the problem, there must be someone inside that's causing the problems that we're having, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a very natural kind of a reaction. Our point of view about this problem is, we're not inside the infrastructure, right? So there's a lot of capabilities and tools that have been built essentially to, I'll use the word spy, but basically to look at behaviors of employees inside of the firewall, right? Mm-hmm. What kind of files are you exfiltrating? What kinds of things are you searching? Are you accessing the network in a way that's appropriate for you based on who you are and the privileges you should have, and so on, right? So there's a lot of tech that does that today to sort of try to identify activities that are internal to the organization that are malicious.
Yep.
I happen to believe that, like you said, John, that most of the time when there is a sort of insider threat event, it's not typically someone who's truly got an axe to grind, right? Of course that happens, right? That's the thing. It is a thing, unfortunately, but it's usually the case that someone's identity is being used for malicious purposes. And so our take on this problem is more that we can identify the people who are most likely to already have had their identity be compromised. Mm-hmm. And that is already being used internally in a way that's inappropriate. Now, your identity may already be compromised. Let's just say the attacker may be lying in wait, just frankly looking at email traffic, trying to identify the target that they want to go after, trying to build insight about the organization, collect intelligence. Right? There's a lot of reasons that just owning that identity for an attacker can be useful until they want to use it. Right? So yeah. So I think this idea of a malicious insider, for me, it's really helpful to decouple it from the idea that it's John. It's not John, it's John's identity, right? Mm-hmm. How's John's online identity? How's his digital identity being used internally? And whether or not it's you, like that can be relatively easily determined. Yeah. But is your identity being abused? And, is it likely to be abused, right? So should there be controls in place on you as an individual, on your identity, that is, that are elevated because of who you are and because of the profile that you have external, right? So
I see.
yeah, so I think that there's a lot of talk about zero trust as just as an example, which I think is a really good framework. We espouse to zero trust as well. We believe in that as well. And I think that there's a lot of inputs into a zero trust framework that are based on internal data, right? Where are you? Should you have access, right? It assumes this idea of privilege and so on. And, I think that any of those types of setups or systems or frameworks that are put in place around zero trust are really incomplete without having an external point of view about how, what is Matt's external risk posture? It's not, is Matt a good person or a bad person? It's right. What's his footprint look like? Is he likely to be the target of an attack? What kind of an attack? Are we prepared to protect from that kind of an attack? Right. So
yeah. All right. So let's say they do capture my identity, let's say, and they're just like sitting on it, lying in wait for a good time to use it. What's the next step for them? Would they do wouldn't they need to have my password to get into the network or?
They might already have your password.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's take, for example, the case where there's actually a recent example of this too, which happened to Cisco, where an employee of Cisco their personal data was involved in a breach. That breach, not their work identity, their personal identity, right?
Yep.
That personal identity information was used to compromise their personal device and get into their Chrome browser where they used the Chrome password manager, right? Probably like a lot of people do.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And they had shared credentials in there, right? So they had company, I believe they had the VPN login information for Cisco VPN, right?
Yeah, so they're in. Yeah.
So they're in, right? So, there's a lot of ways in which this problem is, it's first of all, that's not really your fault, right? That was your breach information was on somebody else's system that got compromised, which is how it ended up in somebody's breach repo somewhere on the dark web or wherever it might be.
Right.
So that's a real problem to deal with, right? And we have a point of view about that as well, for what it's worth, which is that you've got to look at the whole identity of the person, not just the work identity.
Right. So, no, that makes sense. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So are there certain red flags that your company would kind of give advice to other people listening to tell their employees, like, God, I wish I could remember how Hannah got taken. But anyway, just in general, like if someone calls me at work, I had one the other day that was like an automated robot on Amazon.
Yeah,
and I buy so much stuff through Amazon that I kind of was listening to it for a second. It was like 5 a.m. So I was still sleeping. So I just turn it off. And probably that's not an accident either. They probably want to catch you when you're not totally awake. Are there any tips for different red flags that people can watch out for? There's going to be a day where they just have all data sets of our voices and our faces and digital twins and what have you. And there's just going to be like this conversation. They're just going to scrape the data and then use this. And it's going to be
it's part of a voice deep fake at some point, right?
Yeah, probably. But today in 2022, are there any tips you would say for things to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if we separate these issues between, let's say, a work-based way of thinking and a home-based way of thinking, I think to take the simpler version of that, then the home-based way of thinking, don't answer phone calls from people you don't know. If they're calling from Amazon, doesn't call people. That's not a thing,
That's true.
And I had a family member this happened to recently too, as well, right? It can happen to anybody. But so what's interesting is that, and I love it when these people call me. And sometimes if I've got a minute, I'll just answer and just start asking questions, and I'll try to recruit them actually to give me information, right? That's always a fun little game to play. But
sure.
What you typically see happen is that, imagine you get ensnared and you've picked up the phone, someone from Amazon has called, somehow you're down the road in this conversation, and you're 3 or 4 minutes into it, right? They're going to say to you, can you get on your computer? I want to show you something. This is one of the types of techniques, right? I want to show you something on your computer. Okay, sure, I'll play along. But what do you want to show me, right? And what they'll start to try to do is they'll start to try to build confidence that they know something that you don't know, right? And so a great example would be they might send you to, a security website that shows, they've got these cool maps that show attacks happening all over the world. I think F5 Networks has one, and there's one called ThreatBut that I came across the other day that I'd never heard of. There's all these different kinds of these little pew maps. People talk about them, right? So they might send you something like that and sort of show you, oh, geez, there's all these attacks happening all over the world. And, your computer is maybe originating these attacks, and you have this problem that I've got to help you fix, right? And then maybe they'll send you to like a Wikipedia page about a Trojan or a scary worm or whatever, right? They'll try to spin this story by basically presenting the idea that they know they're an expert, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's all relatively harmless. Although I would say, like, in general, you probably shouldn't be going to websites that people that you don't know are calling you and directing you to,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But where it gets bad, where it goes from not great to really a problem is when they say, can you log into someplace like AnyDesk or Glance or one of these websites that allows for screen sharing or remote desktop access? And, that is where this goes from being not great to being a real serious problem.
Gotcha. Because then they can see your screen and get access to the keystrokes, maybe, or
yeah, sure. They could try to install some sort of remote software in your computer. Depending on exactly how long they're in there and what they could do, they could basically just hang out too, right? Maybe if you're not a well-educated technology person, right, they could just, you might forget to close the browser. I mean, anything could happen, right? So, so that's, I think if you're at home and you've ended up in a situation like that, those are some things to watch out for, right? Just some cues to be aware of.
Right.
And I think best practices for individuals, multi-factor authentication on everything you can put it on, especially banking, healthcare, personal email.
Yeah.
Those are must-haves and must-dos, and those are generally all offered. In those kinds of applications. That's super important. And the work context is totally different, right? Every security team has their own point of view about how to report a security incident and what to do and so on. And so my first thing would be to say, like, get in touch with the security team right away, let them know what happened. And, if you're in a security team and you don't already have multi-factor on all of your key crown jewels, like, you probably should do that right away.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm sure there's, most organizations have a level of sophistication that, is going to prevent the most basic kinds of attacks. But
yeah. Well, obviously, I guess the general rule of thought years ago was make sure you have a complex password and make sure all your passwords are different from one account to another. And then for years, people were saying, make sure you change your password every 90 days. But it seems to me that is a bad idea. MFA kind of makes it, or a two-factor authentication makes it obsolete at this point. But the whole thing of changing your password all the time is not probably the best idea, because you're just going to, you're going to use some variation of that same password, because who can remember all these different passwords? Or you're going to, like, write it down somewhere on a Post-it note on the computer. It's ultimately going to be less safe, or at least that's the argument.
Yeah. And there's a whole passwordless movement too, right? I think that for a lot of people, a good password manager is a good investment. A lot of companies pay for one for their employees as well. I think that's a good investment. The reason to use a unique password and to change it regularly is, one, just good security hygiene, but also two, think about if you were that Cisco engineer who had their personal password involved in a breach, and that personal password is being reused to access the Cisco VPN, right? So, so actually changing and rotating those passwords with some frequency is important, not because you have a bad password, but because you've given that password to an organization that may inadvertently have been involved in a breach. And now that password is, it's not your fault, right? It's out of your control. It's public now, right? So that's fair.
That's a good point, actually. Well, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, you've got a good one in here about the metaverse, and which I think is kind of an interesting one. And first of all, I don't even know what the metaverse is, or where it is, or when it's coming, or whatever, right? Like, it's this thing that's been imagined. But I do think that this sort of idea of the digitization of our lives and of everything is a real thing. And
no doubt.
Yeah. And I think that, the kind of things that we've been talking about today that really circle around protecting yourself online from attacks, are really important, and even more so in a virtual world, whether it's the metaverse or something like that. Right. And so, having someone who is your digital twin, who's, tries to steal your identity or is you digitally, right? Like, it's a pretty scary idea. There's a lot of technology that hasn't even been invented yet to deal with that. I think it's sort of, people talk about Web3 or we've talked about Web4 yet. I don't even know, but
Well, it remains to be seen who the big players are going to be and exactly how dangerous the space is going to be from a security and privacy and just mental health standpoint for younger generations, or everyone, actually. But I'm sure Zuckerberg will put, some proper guardrails in. And
sure. He's a real champion for privacy and security,
This is true. We'll see what happens. Is there any chance chance it could just be a fad and that maybe we won't all be wearing headsets and walking around? Like CVS, I remember, was buying up real estate in the metaverse.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of, oh man, this is really like happening. But this is like 18 months ago. And now I'm kind of like, wait, no one's buying these NFTs anymore. Maybe it is a blip on the screen, like Y2K or something. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of money that's flowed into this space, right? There's a lot of venture dollars that are in this space already. Yep. I suspect that it will happen. I just suspect that the timeline is significantly longer than people think it is, right? So think about, I don't know, self-driving cars as an example.
Yep.
How long have we been talking about self-driving cars? I mean, since 1950, probably, right? So, or maybe even before that. So, and even Tesla, right? Tesla has like this, people are paying real dollars that they worked hard for to have a self-driving capability that, based on what I've seen, works sort of. I'm definitely not signing up to take a nap while the car drives me around, but
you pay 10 grand just to give your data to Tesla, help them.
That's right. For the opportunity, for the opportunity to maybe have a self-driving vehicle at some point in the future.
Right. Well, I think in that case, the technology is probably there, or it's in its infancy, but it probably exists, and it's more of a legal or a liability issue, right? Like we don't have the infrastructure in place and all the different state laws and the federal, globally, you can just see it being an issue.
For sure, yeah.
And I guess it's the same with the metaverse too. The thing that scares me about all these emerging technologies is that Capitol Hill is always playing catch up to the technologies. I think we can foresee the problems to an extent, but these companies have deep pockets and they have lobbyists looking out for their interests. So I think it should be interesting to see how it all shakes out. But Picnic's doing great things.
Yeah, we feel like we're on the cutting edge of trying to be on the other side of the problem, right? And trying to really help solve a problem that I think a lot of security teams thought was unsolvable. We've had some really interesting conversations recently with very sophisticated security teams that have said, before we met you, we thought this problem was unsolvable, and and they're really excited to be deploying Picnic because actually we can start to solve the problem for them. So we're it's glad to be invited on to talk about the problem space and what we're doing. And I think it's a super important thing.
To what extent have you reached out directly to the Axioses or the LexisNexuses of the world, the data brokers themselves, or even like the Facebooks and Twitters or the social media companies to say like, hey, look, you guys could make everyone's life easier by making these changes, or am I just reaching here?
I'm sure at some point there will be a conversation with those kinds of organizations about this problem from our point of view. I think right now, these organizations frankly make too much money from this data to even consider, for them to be forced, let's say, into making a change is going to require some kind of regulatory change. And so until we get to that point, what that means essentially is that individuals have to take ownership over their own privacy and their own security, and organizations need to be smarter about their security based on, intelligence about the external environment, right? Like until we get to a place where it's handled differently, that's going to be the MO.
Right. Apple, I guess a couple quarters back, they made it harder, I guess, for different apps to track you across different apps. And I think part of it was probably to keep people in the Apple ecosystem. It really hit Facebook hard, right? That hit their bottom line pretty aggressively. I'm wondering, all of us are talking about social engineering and data privacy, and it's becoming more topical just for, people on the street. As that happens, I think more and more companies are going to have to, whether it's from a place of altruism or from a business standpoint, they're going to have to kind of respect that this is the changing tide and it's the right thing to do. But regardless, I think we'll see some changes. Yeah, but it might just come from Capitol Hill and
it's possible that we could see some economic drivers for change, right? That people could, let's say, I don't know, it's hard to imagine that Facebook would ever offer a paid version of Facebook where they don't share your data. But I mean, there are different companies that have a different approach and a different point of view about this. There's a search engine that's recently been created that you pay for access to that doesn't have any ad data. They don't sell any data. I think DuckDuckGo is doing some great stuff around this problem.
Yeah. Our CEO swears by DuckDuckGo. Zoho's building out their own browser too. I'll share that with you later. Yeah. I won't plug it on the pod, but yeah. It makes my life easier, to say, look, our company is doing this because they think it's the right thing to do. And so I think more companies could take advantage of that. But you're right. If you're Facebook or you're a data broker and your business is literally selling other people's information, then it's too ingrained ingrained in your business model to pivot at that point. Yeah, which is a shame, but that's
I also think it's like a little bit of a generational thing. If you look at let's just sort of say our parents' generation and older, their knowledge of technology and security and things like that, they're playing catch up, right? They don't understand all of it. Most of them don't understand all of it. And if you look at the generation that is ahead of us, I guess I would say, right, the younger generations, right, they're more of these sort of digital natives that have lived in that space. And so I actually think that this problem itself is one that, frankly, the folks that are between the ages of, let's sort of say 35 and 50 today, that have lived in both worlds are actually most well equipped to tackle, because they understand both sides of it. Whereas, folks that didn't really have it and they don't really understand it versus people who've never known anything else, like they can't see the difference, right? But it's really the folks that kind of have lived in both worlds and understand, like, hey, it's actually not okay. You're selling all my personal data online. That's not all right,
I hear your argument and I 100% agree with you, but I will say we are biased because we fall directly in that age.
Oh, absolutely, right? Absolutely.
Window. So it's kind of
I'm sure everyone who's, like 34 or 51 is deeply offended, right? But like
no, it's true. The younger generations the metaverse to them will probably just be second nature, But getting old is a mixed bag, I'd say.
It's a mixed bag. I wouldn't go back though. I wouldn't go back. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, Matt, this has been really fun, man. That brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thank you very much to Matt, and a big thank you to everyone for listening. If you have any feedback or any comments, please leave them in the comments section and we'll get back to you. And please stay tuned for our next installment.